We are on the front page. We are going to now be assessing the opposition leader's presentation in the House of Representatives yesterday. He says it's a fairy tale. That's how he's characterizing the budget of the government. He says, Mr. Golding, that is, who was making his contribution to the budget debate yesterday, dismissed the government's message of returning to prosperity out of the COVID-19 pandemic as fiction.
The Minister of Finance says we're doing well. That is a fantasy. Who are the we of which he is speaking? Not the people in my constituency, not the people in East Rural St. Andrew or the people in Southeast St. Elizabeth. Only a few, the well-connected and the fortunate, are making money and living well. Many Jamaicans are living hand to mouth. They can't pay the bills. They are feeling the burdens of an economy pressured by 2 years of COVID-19 and now the Russia-Ukraine war. That is their reality.
And Mr. Golding chided the government for misleading Jamaicans with what he sees as the hype of no new taxes. He said the government is projected to collect $99 billion in additional tax revenue in the next fiscal year.
Last week, Tuesday, the minister beat his chest and colleagues on that side beat their desks as he announced that there will be no new taxes. I say to the people of Jamaica, do not be fooled by the hype. The government plans to collect $99 billion more in taxes this coming fiscal year than the year just ending. 99 billion more taxes from the people. Imagine this is happening in a year when many have not recovered from the COVID recession and many more are facing hunger and sufferation from the effects of the war in Ukraine. $99 billion more in taxes, Madam Speaker. This is unconscionable in a time like this.
The opposition leader also slammed the government for what he views as inadequate expenditure to help the people through care packages and fuel cost relief. According to Mr. Golding, Jamaicans will face an onslaught due to the war in Ukraine, and the government's budget doesn't go far enough, he says, in protecting Jamaicans from that impact.
And to assess the budget presentation of the opposition leader, Mark Golding, we have joining us chartered accountant and financial commentator Dennis Chung, as well as financial journalist and CEO of Kalilah Reynolds Media, Kalilah Reynolds. Good morning to you, lady and gentlemen.
Hi, good morning, Tana. Good morning, Ricardo, and to Dennis as well. And let me also say happy birthday to Jermaine King. Hope he has a great day.
He's smiling across the glass.
Good morning, Kalilah. So let me ask you, Kalilah, first of all, your overall reaction to what you heard from the opposition leader yesterday.
All right, so the opposition leader had some solid points in his presentation, but there were also some weaknesses. Among the points that I give him credit for is the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the spiraling oil prices that we have been experiencing. We've all seen what the prices have been like at the pumps, the gasoline prices. We all have to deal with that. And I don't know that that was adequately compensated for in this budget. Granted, this crisis started around the end of February, and so the time frame to present or to make amendments to the budget would have been limited. As a matter of fact, the budget was tabled before the crisis began. So indeed, he has a point when he says that there will need to be a supplementary budget, quite possibly to account for some of the differences and the assumptions that were made in the crafting of this budget. So that's one thing that I do give him credit for. Another thing that I give him credit for is, well, a part of the suggestion on the minimum wage. And I heard the member for the spokesman on finance, Julian Robinson, also commenting on the minimum wage, saying that rather than $9,000, it should have been increased to $12,000. Now, while I think that this increase is too steep for one go, because remember, we're coming from $7,000, and so to raise it in one go to $12,000 would be a 71% increase, and that would be tough for many employers to deal with. I do agree that the minimum wage needs to be higher. There needs to be a livable wage, but I think that in order to get there, we need to do it incrementally. And so the part of his presentation that I did agree with is for there to be an annual inflation adjustment to the minimum wage, rather than waiting on whenever parliamentarians feel like the minimum wage should be increased. The last increase was 4 years ago, which is much too long. When it
Dennis,
comes to
sorry.
weaknesses of the presentation, you want to go
No,
ahead?
go ahead, Kalilah. Finish the point.
All right, so weaknesses of the presentation. He did make many promises and things that he said the PNP would institute once they are elected to government. Among those, we see increasing tax-free duty imports or duty-free imports from $50 to $150, which is a very popular thing to say. It would get a lot of attention. People have been clamoring for that. Also reducing the cost of clearing barrels at the wharf, forgiving student loan debt, $7 billion of it, making tertiary education more accessible, and so on and so forth. But where I think he fell down and what is a weakness is in not telling us how they're going to pay for it. Whenever I hear promises like these, I always listen out to hear, okay, what is your plan? Like, how would this be funded? How much would this cost the government? Because things like this, they sound good to promise, but is there a tangible plan for it to actually be feasible?
Right. And Dennis Chung, those points Kalilah just made, the weaknesses as she sees them in the presentation by the opposition leader, he says will not adversely affect the budget. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I don't know how he got to that, because I think that the technocrats should have sat down and considered all of that. For example, when he spoke about the windfall at $130 per barrel, oil is not $100 per barrel. It shifts, it changes daily, right? And when we talk about the average price of $67.50, the average price of $67.50 considers the average over the year beginning April 1, 2022 to March 31, 2023. So we're not even in the first month, right? So it's quite possible, based on the technical predictions, that oil could average $67.50. So, let's be clear. I mean, I think that a lot of the responses that we're seeing to it about recasting and all of that is really emotional and is not considering the fact that we are just dealing with a situation right now, which is an extraordinary situation. But when inflation comes down, when production starts going back up, when the war ends, there's going to be a level of normality. And what normally happens is that when you have periods of high inflation, because economies go through cycles, right? Then there's an adjustment the other way because the market adjusts. So therefore, it's very important to understand that. I mean, I hear the cry also about fuel taxes, but guess what? I am against reducing fuel taxes. All right, I'm against also pushing out too much money into the economy, like reducing duties. I mean, those things as
So you don't accept that additional $40 billion in spending? He says about 2% of GDP.
No, and let me tell you why. And if it was last year when production was low and people were not working, you have a case for it. But the fact of the matter is that we're already at inflation of 9%, right? If you put more
It's
money
10% now, 10.7, so nearly 11.
Right.
Yeah. If you put more money into an economy like this with productivity, you're going to have even more inflation because you're going to have more money chasing the same amount of goods, right? So timing is very, very important. Now, what it means is that there are some fiscal policy initiatives that need to happen. Agree.
Sorry, Dennis?
Dennis? Breaking up a little bit.
All right,
But we're going to take the break and then come back for Dennis to complete his point. And Kalilah, I want to hear you on what Mr. Golding is saying, where he declares that it's time to loosen the purse a little bit and spend $40 billion, which would amount to about 2% of the GDP to address these social welfare deficits. We have Dennis Chung, who is a chartered accountant and financial commentator, as well as Kalilah Reynolds, financial journalist and CEO of Kalilah Reynolds Media. Dennis, before the break, you were making a point, but we got disconnected.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that, we don't produce oil, right? One of the things to bear in mind, remember I talk about timing, right? Understand the economy that we're in. So if we were to reduce or eliminate the tax on oil, right, then what it would mean is that we would have an increase in demand for the quantities. It means that you're talking about further pressure on your foreign exchange rate. If the foreign exchange rate goes up, we import 90% of what we consume. It's going to be across the board. And I agree that prices are high, but what we should be doing, as the minister had said, is look at things like reducing the duty on electric vehicles. And I think it should be zero, by the way. It shouldn't be 10%. I think we should be eliminating duties on renewable equipment, right? We should be taking the excess that we get from the tax and putting that money into putting a good public transportation system in place. Because I understand the emotions about saying, oh, we need to give people money, but we've been doing that for decades, and every year. I remember the days, when we used to shudder in the private sector about what new taxes are coming, because certainly taxes are coming, right? We can't run an economy like that. We cannot go back to the days of 2013. I was at the PSOJ when we were dealing with the IMF agreement, and it was very dark days. We don't want to get back there, right? So what we need to do is put policies in place that is going to reduce our dependence on imports, right, and resuscitate local production. That when we do that, right, then we can start getting more money into the economy, and then we don't have to worry about inflation. But if we get to this stage where we keep giving away, and you're giving away everything that you don't have, you're just building other people's economies,
Hold it right there, Dennis. Want to hear you, Kalilah, on this suggestion by the opposition leader saying loosen the purse strings a bit more, and it's not time for fiscal conservatism.
I think that is a dangerous statement to make, especially in a time when we are still in the midst of a pandemic and we have the Russia-Ukraine war pending. It is a time to be conservative indeed. I think what has bedeviled Jamaica for decades is this issue of making politically nice sounding promises and implementing things for the political points in the short term at the expense of the long term gain. And what happens now is that Jamaica is on a sustainable debt trajectory, and reducing that debt needs to remain our priority. If the purse strings are loosened to the extent to which the opposition suggests, which is $40 billion, that would throw us substantially off track in terms of meeting those debt to GDP targets. And it's not that debt is unimportant, because we have to make the sacrifice in the short term in order to benefit in the long term, so that in the long term, our people are better off. And I understand that, yes, there are financial hardships that people are facing now. And yes, there needs to be more done. I take the opposition's point that the $2 billion fund for transportation relief is not enough. And I eagerly await the finance minister's declaration of how that is going to be allocated in his closing budget presentation.
Also, want to hear as well, Kalilah, the follow-up. You're speaking on the $40 billion, but what's your take on capping the ad valorem tax on fuel? That was suggested yesterday by the opposition leader as the way to go instead of the $2 billion
fund, right?
Right. So when it comes to the tax on fuel, my issue has been the $7 that had been added for the hedge tax. So since the hedge has been removed, that $7 has remained on the SCT, on the special consumption tax, as a tax on fuel. And I do not support a tax that remains there and not used for the intended purpose. So you're still charging us for something that you no longer use. It's not there for its intended purpose. And so I would like to see that either removed, or at least there be something to say, this is specifically what we are using it for, and this is why we're charging you this tax. But I don't like the fact that a tax is there that was implemented for a specific purpose. The purpose is no longer in use, yet we're still being charged that.
So on the flip then, Dennis, would you side with the opposition spokesman on finance suggestion that money that's coming from the hedge, $67 billion, I think he said, all of that should go towards this tax relief fund instead of the $2 billion?
No.
Okay.
No.
Why not?
I believe that they could look at doing a little more, but let me tell you why. And I totally agree with Kalilah. It is unethical to tell you that you're going to use a tax for something, I use it for something else. But guess what? We've always done it. We did it with NHT how many years? We did it with the education tax.
Still doesn't
Everything
make it
that
right.
goes into this thing called
Right.
a black hole, the consolidated fund, and it don't come back out. Right? But the fact of the matter is that since we're there, let us since they have already broken all morality and ethics already, right? Let's just continue with it a little bit, right? I'm saying use that money to repurpose. Come to the Jamaican people and say, I'm going to repurpose that money into good public transportation, right? I mean, why is it that we have to be sitting in traffic for 1 hour to move 5 miles? It's ridiculous, right? That is productivity. I did a study an analysis about 3 years ago. We showed that we spend about $200 billion worth of productive time in traffic every year. That's crazy. We don't produce oil, right? Those are the things that we need to be talking about. So let's go further. I mean, no presentation so far has been discussing those things. Those are the things we need to address. How are we moving our children to school, for example, right? That is what we need to address. Not talk about giving away more money.
Right, and so fine. I hear yourself and Kalilah that some of these things, on the face of it, seem unworkable. So what should we be expecting then to hear from the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister when they come, when the Finance Minister closes the debate and when the Prime Minister speaks on Thursday? Starting with you, Kalilah.
Right. So normally what we look out for from the Prime Minister, we've gotten accustomed to hearing the goodies, right? So what are the giveaways for the people? And indeed, in a time like this, we are especially anticipating what are the benefits to be had from this particular budget, because people are facing undue hardship, especially with this issue of high fuel prices. I saw Statin release the numbers, the latest inflation numbers, just either this morning or last night, and I see where transport, the sector for transport inflation is at 10%. And now recall as well that the fuel sector, the fuel prices sector, subsector of the transport inflation numbers isn't as heavily weighted as the public transportation sector. So when bus and taxi fares go up, you see a huge spike in the transport sector of the inflation index. But when fuel prices go up, you don't see as large of an increase. So to see that we now have a 10% spike in the transport sector, which is very high, given that we don't normally take, or Statin doesn't take into account as much, or doesn't weight as heavily fuel prices, that tells you that it is a really significant impact. And when it comes to who is going to benefit from this $2 billion program, I think that the motoring public has to be taken into account. Public transportation sector has to be taken into account. They will need relief. Private transportation providers need to be taken into account. And the middle class, especially, because many people in the middle class are living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck,
Right.
they need to be taken into account. So I'm especially looking forward to hearing what both gentlemen will say about that particular program.
And for you, Dennis?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to hear about any goodies and giveaway, right? Because, for example, the banknote thing, I think for me it's just a fashion show, right? That, it looked good, but I couldn't care less if Kermit the Frog was on $100 US. I would prefer it to all my national heroes on a Jamaican $100, right? In terms of value in my pocket, right? So what do I want to hear the PM talk about? I want to hear the PM address the issue of crime and law and order, how we're going to address those in a sustainable manner. I'd like to hear him speak about the informal settlements also, and how we're going to repurpose those and put some structure into it, and speak about bringing back things like a good transportation system, right? Addressing things to do with legislation.
But what about those bread and butter issues people are facing, Dennis?
The bread and butter issues, right? I mean, he can mention them, but the thing is that they should not be the priority, because if you fix the other things, those things will fall into place, right? So how am I going to get my SMEs going? For example, I have always been a proponent that when you by putting stimulus into the economy, you should not just give it to people. What you should be doing is saying to people in small businesses, listen, I am going to purchase services and goods from you. Encourage people to produce things, and that is how you get money into the economy, right? So you're putting stimulus in, not just putting it in the hands of people, because when you put it in the hands of people, guess what? They're going to go and use those courier services and carry things in from Amazon, right, or overseas. That money is going back out. But put it into the productive sector. So those are some of the things I'd love to see him address. How are we going to deal with the SMEs, for example, right? And get them going again, because that is the lifeblood of the economy. And how are we going to deal with agriculture? Pray their last name. Those are the things that we need to address if we want to move the economy forward.
So I hear you saying address the big picture, and you think that the smaller issues will eventually take care of themselves.
It will fall into place. I mean, the way to deal with your leaking roof sustainability is to fix the roof in and not put a bucket in there.
And let me just add quickly to the middle class point I was making as well, Tana and Ricardo, because when it comes to gas prices, the middle class are more adversely affected than the poorer class of people, because poorer class don't drive their own car for the most part. They rely on public transportation, and those costs are fixed. Who drives? Who are the members of the motoring public who are going to be most affected?
We have to leave it there, I suspect, for the rest of the day. These conversations will continue. But thank you so much, Kalilah, Reynolds, Dennis Strong. Thanks for joining us.